Hi, friends. Rick Edwards here. Thank you for joining me for another session from the Gospel Project. Today we're going to be looking at the core passage of 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 1 through 8 and verses 10 through 17. Also, please note this is the first Sunday or the first session of a new quarter. So we're moving into a new quarter, but we're continuing our study through the Old Testament and specifically through the books of 1 Kings. We've looked at 1st and 2nd Samuel. Now we're in 1 Kings. We'll be staying in 1 Kings for a little bit, but we're looking at the monarchy. And this whole season of time is very interesting and important for us to understand. Now, we're creating another video that will address the monarchy and the place of the monarchy in this book, in these two books, the 1st and 2nd Kings, which originally was one book, but because of length, the book of Kings was divided into two books, 1st and 2nd Kings. Excuse me. But originally it was one book, and there's one story that's told in the book of Kings, or 1st and 2nd Kings. That's kind of another story, although it's very relevant. You may want to check out that other video. So as we think about this particular story, which is the story of how the United Kingdom, or the United Monarchy, Israel under one king, initially Saul, then David, and then Solomon. But now in this story, we're going to see how the kingdom divides, how the kingdom splits. It's a fascinating story and a really important story for us historically to understand. But I want to encourage you to ask a question, because this is central to what the story is really about. The question you might ask your class at the beginning is simply this: can God use judgment to accomplish his purposes? Can God use judgment to accomplish his purposes? Now, we normally think of judgment as God kind of stepping into a situation, or stepping into history perhaps, and doing something in response to sin, whether it's an individual or whether it's a people. God brings judgment as a result of their sinful behavior. But what's important for us to understand is that oftentimes God will then later use the circumstances that come out of that judgment. He brings judgment because of sin, but then he will later bring good out of the circumstances associated with that judgment. And that's what we're going to see in this particular story. Although your class may not fully understand that initially. They may not understand how sometimes God brings good out of judgment. So I would encourage you just to ask that question. Let people kick that around a little bit. I think that's a pretty insightful question for them to consider. Now, I want to point out some things here in order to help you get a good grasp of this story, what's going on. The story is about judgment. And if you look carefully at it, you're going to see that the judgment is on Solomon. Now, if you'll recall, we go back to Solomon's life, actually in chapter 11, one chapter earlier. It tells us that Solomon loved many foreign wives. And as a result of his love for these foreign wives, they drew his heart away from the Lord. They encouraged him, and he succumbed to their foreign influence, and he began to worship and allow the worship of other gods in Israel. And God was terribly displeased with this. He could not stand for this. So he brings judgment on Solomon. But what's interesting is that he says, because of your father David, I'm not going to bring judgment on you, Solomon. I'm going to bring judgment on your son. And I'm going to tear the kingdom away from your son. So Solomon was able to live out his life, although he did not live to be an old man. Solomon was able to live out his life with some degree of blessing by God. But after Solomon dies, his son Rehoboam takes the reins, and that's where we begin to see the fulfillment of this earlier prophecy when God said, I'm going to tear the kingdom apart because of your sin, Solomon. So it's important for us to understand that the judgment that we see, this whole incident of the kingdom dividing, was an act of God's judgment, okay? He made this happen, and that actually is pointed out in the text more than once, where it's clear that God is bringing about this division of the kingdom because of Solomon's sin. So the whole story is about judgment and judgment on Solomon. Now, it's important to note that while when you read the text, you have to kind of come away and say, well, wow, Rehoboam was really foolish. And he was. He operated foolishly in these verses of chapter 12. Rehoboam made some big mistakes, although that's not really the problem here. Yeah, he was foolish, and interestingly, his foolishness sort of sets him up in contrast to his father Solomon, who was so wise. But interestingly, the problem here was not Rehoboam's foolishness. Now, that's the catalyst for this thing happening. That's the reason that Israel comes together and they say, hey, if you're not going to listen to us, if you're not going to make things easier for us, then we're going to split away from the house of David. We're going to split away from Judah. We're going to split away from the kingdom. But ultimately, we need to understand that even while Rehoboam was the catalyst for what happens here, the real problem, the real cause of the division is because God was bringing judgment on Solomon's mistakes a generation earlier. Okay? So keep that in mind. Now, I want to point out here that the split ultimately, while it was an act of judgment on Solomon, the split or the division of the kingdom ultimately served a good purpose. It ultimately served, I believe, God's purposes. So let me explain how the split ultimately protected the lineage that God was creating, that God was planning to use in order to someday bring the Messiah. So very early, ever since Genesis chapter 3, when Adam and Eve sinned, you'll recall, and by the way, we're going to have another video about this very thing, but just to shorten it here, in summary, going back to Genesis 3, Adam and Eve sinned, and God said, he pronounced judgment on the couple and on the serpent, but then he says, I'm going to bring a seed. He speaks to Eve and says, through you, I'm going to bring a seed, a descendant. Someone will come from you, Eve, who ultimately will reverse things and fix things. And now we know from a New Testament perspective that ultimately the seed that was promised to Eve and Adam in Genesis 3:15 was in fact Jesus. That ultimately it was Jesus and his sacrifice and resurrection that is going to reverse and is reversing the impact of the fall all the way back in Genesis chapter 3. But when God made that promise in Genesis 3, it set in motion a chain of events whereby God is narrowing a lineage. He is choosing a lineage. And again, we've got another video that we're going to be talking about this in more detail. But what's important to understand, if you'll read carefully, especially through Genesis, the early chapters of Genesis, up through chapter 11, we see time and again how God chooses one of the descendants of Eve over his brothers. And that's not to say that it's not an issue of heaven and hell. It's not an issue of salvation. But God is protecting a lineage. So he's choosing, for example, Seth as opposed to Cain. He actually chose Abel over Cain. Cain kills Abel. And then God brings another son into the picture named Seth. And ultimately, Seth is chosen over Cain. And this happens over and over and over. So that there is a lineage. If you read through Genesis carefully, you're going to see that there is a lineage that God is creating and protecting this lineage. So ultimately it comes down, at some point, lots of interesting things happen throughout these books, but then it comes down to David in 2 Samuel chapter 7, and God promises David, this is part of the Davidic covenant that we've looked at before, God promises David that one of your descendants, first of all, David, I'm going to give you a dynasty, a house, and someone on your house that the Messiah ultimately is going to come through one of the kings who follows you. So there's been this narrowing process of creating this lineage and protecting this lineage. that ultimately the Messiah would come through this lineage. Now it's going to come through a descendant of David, and not just any descendant of David. It has to be a descendant of someone who's been on the throne. And we see ultimately in Matthew chapter 1 that is in fact what happened. Jesus is a descendant of one of the kings who came from David. But there's this lineage that has to be protected. And I believe that one of the reasons God allows this split to occur, allows Israel to split off from Judah, is because he needed to protect and wanted to protect this lineage. If the nation had stayed together, I believe that ultimately the sin of the northern kingdom and the sin of Judah would have ultimately caused a problem or replaced the Davidic dynasty. I think the Davidic dynasty, the lineage, would have been vulnerable had Israel stayed part of Judah, part of the United Kingdom. So I believe that ultimately the split occurred. God judged Solomon by dividing the nation, but the split ultimately protected the lineage by splitting Israel off. Judah's dynasty, the Davidic dynasty, was safeguarded and protected, whereas it would have been more vulnerable had Israel stayed part of the United Kingdom. So I believe that much of this story, one of the big takeaways for this story, is that God's judgment served his purposes. He brought judgment on Solomon through the divided kingdom, but in so doing, he then set up a situation where he could protect the lineage that served his purposes. And so we know ultimately that Jesus came from this lineage that survived in Judah, survived in the southern kingdom, in part, I believe, because the northern kingdom had to split away. So this lesson, I think, is an important lesson to understand that sometimes God brings judgment into our lives or brings judgment onto a people, but he ultimately is able to use the consequences of that judgment or the circumstances of that judgment or the context of that judgment to bring about his purposes and to accomplish his purposes in perhaps our own lives, perhaps in the lives of people around us. So judgment, while it is never pleasant, is never something we want. It's never something God wants to do in anybody's life. When it's necessary, when God brings judgment, he is also able, at some point after that, he's able to bring about good and accomplish his purposes as a consequence of that judgment. So I think that's an important point and something that your class can take home and really understand and apply to their own lives, and understanding that I may have done something bad in the past. I may have experienced judgment in the past, or perhaps someone I know has, or perhaps I was part of the fallout of that judgment, but God can still bring good out of it, and God can accomplish his purposes even through the judgment that he often has to bring into our lives. I hope that's been helpful to you. Thank you very much. We'll see you next time.